Great, fantastic. So thanks very much for the introduction, and thanks to Lisa and Annalena for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to speak today. So I'm hoping to reflect a little bit on a problem that I see in my discipline, namely what I describe as the problem of utilizing black boxes for user assessment. Basically, this problem of how library user data is often distributed across multiple systems from various providers, and we don't always know what's going on behind the scenes in actually how that data is created. And these are kind of somewhat sketchy thoughts maybe on the impact of how these various data sources kind of affect user assessment in library and information studies. And the paper itself builds on the work that was previously mentioned, which was a project I led entitled Digital Library Futures, which is an AHRC funded project which ran from 2017 to 2019 and looked at the impact of non-print legal deposit on academic deposit libraries and their users. We were really interested in that project on discovering how the posterity-driven mission of legal deposit interacts with and often contrasts or is in tension with issues surrounding contemporary access and usage of digital materials. We published a white paper last year, which I've included a link to there, and I can paste a link into the chat later on when I finish speaking for those who are interested in reading it. And that goes into more detail on the project findings, because we're not going to be going too much into it. It's sort of a slightly tangential discussion that I'm going to be having today. We've discussed legal deposit before, but just to kind of reiterate, it's that legal requirement that a person or group submit copies of their publications to a trusted repository. And in the UK, publishers have long had to provide a copy of every print publication to the British Library, with the other 5 legal deposit libraries in the UK entitled to request one. In 2013, the Legal Deposit Libraries Non-Print Works Regulations 2013 were introduced, and this extended that entitlement to digital publications in writing, obviously including the web domain, the web archive, which we've heard a great deal about today. And this was what gave rise to the term non-print legal deposit, or NPLD for short. So a little bit more about my work. I kind of see my work on this subject and more generally as part of a tradition of user studies, user assessment that spans library and information studies and digital humanities. And kind of I set out to understand how the digital turn in particular has affected usage of our library collections in order to do things like inform library practice, to develop theoretical and practical models of information behavior, and also to intervene in discussions and regulatory environments as well. And I'm really interested in how our digital collections are kind of put to work, as this quote kind of indicates. The questions like, what can people actually do with our collections? How is this different from what they used to do? And how does this affect things like institutional practices, regulatory frameworks, and how we actually view our digital library and archival collections? So in my title, I referred to this concept of critical addressability, and I've adopted this term from Thomas Bedelia's work, which he's been published recently about collections as data. And in this description of critical addressability, what he's trying to do is this idea that we should actually be able to evaluate the technical and social processes that shape our data through transparency of the data and through data documentation. He's also in this collections as data trying to develop a framework for preparing digital collections for computational reuse. There's also fantastic work, and we've heard some examples today around interfaces for access. But in terms of this environment of user assessment that I'm describing, I think there's a lack of similar critique, a lack of critical addressability around the creation and analysis of the data we rely on in this work. And one of the examples of how this lack of critique is represented, and I don't mean to pick on Google Analytics. I know it's always seems easy to pick on Google, but Google Analytics is a great example of this. It's something that's been heavily used and widely adopted in library user studies, but it's largely been a black box based approach. We might see some customization of features, but it's largely absent of a sustained consideration of what's actually going on inside that Google Analytics black box. We ultimately don't know what the raw data looks like, and we can we know aspects of how that data is processed, but we don't actually have control of the processing of that data. And for a community that's so immersed in methodological and ethical considerations in other respects, I kind of see this as a bit of an oversight. I've written in the past about this as well, like the fact that raw data is hidden from Google Analytics users, and there's good reasons for that, but it means that we lack reproducible data. We lack transparent data when we're using something like Google Analytics. And this black box approach means we don't really understand the data itself and the biases and the human factors in its creation. Asher et al. In the quote I've included here hint at some of those possible biases. So in order to truly understand usage, we need to actually be able to understand how the data is produced, not just what it says. And the problem we have is that so much library data beyond just these analytics can become a black box if we're not careful to understand how that data is produced. So to return back to non-print legal deposit, when we were doing this project, we were really interested in uncovering the link between usage of our collections, of the NPLD collections, the types of materials being requested, and what this might tell us about which disciplines are engaging with NPLD and on what subject. So we set out to analyze usage of the NPLD ebook and e-journal collections based on the subjects of the material that was accessed. And we received a data set from the British Library which contained descriptive metadata records for all title requests. In the case of ebook access requests, which I'm briefly going to discuss here, we received just over 90,000 access requests across 6 legal deposit libraries. That data actually came without subject metadata. So we created a Python-based tool called Subjectify. And what that did was it just pulled in library classification data from the OCLC Classify 2 API service. And Classify 2 is actually linked to the WorldCat data. So it's pulling in subject class marks directly from WorldCat. And this allowed us to identify subject-based patterns of usage of NPLD materials, but it also emphasizes a huge problem when we turn to that question of critical addressability, which is that it's not just about things like Google Analytics that we can treat as black box. So this slide shows just very briefly the results of our ebook analysis. This was using the Dewey Decimal Class Mark system. So Dewey, for those who aren't familiar, is a classification scheme that emerged in the 19th century and provides a universal classification of library resources using numbers from 0 to 999 for high-level categories, and then post-decimal numerals to indicate further information about that text. And what we can see here is we can see heavy usage of things like social sciences books and literature. When we reach this point, which I'm not going to dig into too much now this is the point where what we wanted to hope was happening, where the subject-based analysis can start being put into conversation with things like information behavior theory and models, particularly those that expand on disciplinary differences in information behavior. We've got an expanded paper coming out on this, I'm writing it at the minute, so when it comes out, it's a totally different question, but that's going to dig more into the actual results in due course. But for the purposes of my point today, I want to compare this slide to the Library of Congress classification. So I ran the same data through Library of Congress, and Library of Congress class marks, another widely adopted library classification scheme, uses an alphanumeric system with high-level categories given a letter between A to Z. And we can immediately see between these two slides a real difference in the patterns that we identify in usage. And that's things that were obvious in Dewey actually start to become buried in Library of Congress. First, we can see that language and literature for the Library of Congress is actually the most heavily used rather than social sciences, although social sciences are heavily used. Secondly, we become much more au fait because Library of Congress obviously is an American classification scheme with which books relate to American history than we were from Dewey. And for reference, Library of Congress gives the Watergate affair a similar level within the hierarchy as it gives the ethnography and history of most African countries, which gives you an indication of the levels of detail and the biases that are there. And this black box kind of brings us on to the problem brings us on to this problem of black boxes. We can't, similarly that we can't treat Google Analytics as a black box, we also can't treat classification as a black box because they too shape our analysis. So I'm going to skip forward a little bit just because I'm conscious I'm running out of time here. So this question of we take a lot of ethical decisions in user studies. We do things like anonymizing user data, but it's also an ethical and methodological choice to apply something like a particular classification scheme to data for analysis, and that decision shapes our results. So for me, this kind of raises concerns about how we collect and interpret this data. And I think it goes beyond where we are in the current user studies, the current user assessment literature in library and information studies. So the question for me is how we recognize our analysis of user data as an act of interpretation, not mere reporting of statistics from these various black boxes, whether they're analytics platforms or classification schemes. And this is the next challenge, just to finish up, that I want to address, which is what might it look like to impart this critical addressability into the creation and analysis of library usage data, and how might it take forward our understanding of users. So thanks everyone for listening. I'll wrap up there. I'm really looking forward to hearing what the rest of the panel have to say. Thank you.